The guest for this episode is Carolin Duttlinger. She spoke about Kafka's Allure, Kafka as a reader, and Kafka Oxford Research Center. Carolin Duttlinger, a professor and tutor in German at Wadham College, Oxford. She teaches German literature, film and culture from the 18th century to the present, as well as translation. A particular focus of Carolin's research is the writer Franz Kafka. She is co-director of the Oxford Kafka Research Centre, which hosts conferences and workshops and works closely with the Bodleian Library, where the majority of Kafka's manuscripts are kept. Carolin edited Franz Kafka in Context, a compilation of 35 short accessible essays where leading international scholars explore Kafka's personal and working life, his reception of art and culture, his engagement with political and social issues, and his ongoing reception and influence. Her books include Kafka and Photography and The Cambridge Introduction to Franz Kafka, among others. She writes regularly for the Times Literary Supplement. You may please use the link given in the show notes to buy the books mentioned. Please follow and review the Harshniam podcast on Apple and Spotify apps.
I think what fascinates me about Kafka is just that he's very unpredictable. So, with some writers, you feel after you've read them for a while, you know what they're going to say, you know what sort of themes they're interested in, you know what sort of method or techniques they use. And I think Kafka is quite unique. He's a very spontaneous writer. So when we look at his manuscripts, his notebooks, we see that he never plans any of his stories or novels. He just goes straight in. He has no idea how it's going to unfold, which is why so many of his stories are unfinished and many of them are fragments. But I think it just means that Kafka never really repeats himself. Of course, he has certain themes, he has certain, ideas that he is concerned with. But ultimately, I think Kafka just seems like a very fresh, very engaging writer. So that's what I love about him. And that's why I haven't got bored of him yet.
You were one of the directors for this Oxford Kafka Research Center. And how long you have been associated with Oxford Kafka Research Center?
I think just over 20 years. So I think the center was founded in about 2008. I joined maybe 2 years later. So it hasn't been as old as the university, of course, but it's been going for a while.
Yeah. Can you tell us about its activities, please?
So the centre was really founded because we are very fortunate in Oxford to have most of Kafka's original manuscripts in the collections of the university library. And so that was really the idea, to have a dedicated research centre that also works with the library in terms of, doing research around Kafka's writings. In terms of our activities, partially it's really a centre for academics around the world who are interested in Kafka. And so at the moment, we're very fortunate. It's, of course, the centenary of Kafka's death this year. So he died in 1924. And we have a big £1 million research grant that we are running now for 3 years. The project is called Kafka's Transformative Communities, and it's really about the future of Kafka studies and about Kafka's role in different communities around the world, really. So the center is really partially a forum for academics from around the world, anyone who is interested in Kafka. It's also really, its purpose is also to make Kafka better known to general readers. So it's not just about experts and academics.
No, any publications coming up?
We've got a lot of publications that have come out in the last 20 odd years. I've myself published 4 books on Kafka. And yes, so I'm writing another Kafka book at the moment, which will probably come out in about 2 or 3 years' time. It's called Kafka and Us. And it's meant to be a general introduction to Kafka for general readers. So again, not academic. And then we're also planning some publications to emerge out of this current project.
One of the books that I read is that you edited is Franz Kafka in Context. That's a wonderful book where 35 people who are Kafka scholars, translators, who have come together. How did the idea of compiling the book come by?
the publisher, Cambridge University Press, they have a series called Literature in Context. And so I knew that a colleague was editing a volume on Marcel Proust, the French writer. And so I thought it would be nice to do something on Kafka because, of course, I was already interested in Kafka. And so, yeah, this is how the idea came about. And I thought it would be interesting. So the idea of this book, it's like a handbook, but the focus is not on Kafka's texts. So a lot of, edited handbooks on writers, they focus on the text. So you've got an article on novel A, novel B, and so on. But this is different. So it's not about Kafka's work. It's about the context. It's about the different ways in which we can understand Kafka's life, his times. So there is a section on, for instance, politics and culture. There's a section on different arts, different media. There's a section on different aspects of Kafka's life. And then there's a section on different aspects of Kafka's reception. So, for instance, Kafka's reception in film and so on. And it was very interesting to me because I tried to ask experts in their field. So the idea was to get away from always having the same Kafka experts write these articles and instead ask people who have real expertise in different areas.
In fact, I was wondering, you have compiled the book and you have edited it. How difficult would have been that process of editing it, going through each of them? It is not just about the literature, right? Different aspects.
It was a lot of work. It was probably the most time-consuming book I've worked on because on the one hand, you want each chapter to follow a certain structure so that the reader knows how this handbook works. But you also want to give every author the space and the freedom to really speak about the things they want to speak about. So that was a tricky balance because also I wasn't an expert on some aspects. So, for instance, there was a colleague who wrote an article on Czech literature. So I don't speak Czech. So I wanted to make sure that this colleague could talk about things in a really detailed way. But I learned a lot, and it's interesting. So this book came out in 2018, and I still keep going back to it myself, even though, of course, I edited it. But I've actually, in a sense, forgotten some of the things people wrote about. And now that I'm working on my current book, I keep going back and looking at these articles.
No, you wrote a very interesting foreword to the book. So there are two parts to this question. How do you describe Kafka in person? And does this reflect his personality in his writing?
Yeah, so I remember thinking, what could I say for this introduction? And I thought, let's just think about the role of context. So is Kafka someone who is part of his context, or is he, as many people have argued, a rather isolated figure, who is somehow detached from his time, his society, and so on? And so to find an answer, I looked at Kafka's own writings, his diaries. How does he describe himself? And what I found was that, to give one example, in 1922, when he had just retired from his office job on medical grounds, he goes to a sanatorium. He was suffering from tuberculosis, and he arrives in this new place. And one of the first things he writes is how he feels completely alienated from everyone around him and very detached, very alone, really. And so we could say, aha, this is the Kafka we think we know. This is someone who is almost existentially alienated from his surroundings. But then just 2 or 3 days later, Kafka describes in the same diary how he very much enjoyed being with other people. So he writes the joy of being with others. And for me, that was really a key aspect of this book, and really it's what I want to do in my research more generally. I want to show that with Kafka, it's never just about one thing. It's always about looking at an issue from both sides. So Kafka is an incredibly self-questioning writer, and that's precisely what makes his work so worthwhile reading. So again, it's very difficult to know exactly what sort of a person Kafka was. I think we have to be careful. We read his diaries, we read his letters. They're very intimate documents, but nonetheless, I think when we think of ourselves, how do we write to others? Even how do we write about ourselves? Is this really who we are? But of course, we have to start somewhere. So if you ask me what sort of a person was Kafka, I think Kafka was a man of contradictions. He was someone who had deep periods of depression, but he was also a very funny guy who had lots of friends. He was, on some level, there was certainly an aspect of him who wanted to withdraw from the world, be alone, be left alone to write, which was really his passion. But at the same time, he also loved to go out, go to the cinema, go to the theatre. He was very sporty. He had lots of friends. He had lots of interests. He liked to travel as a young man. And so I would say that we find all of these different aspects in his writing, sometimes at the same time. But it's definitely always worth, I think, understanding about Kafka's world, about his environment, about his passions, his interests, and to see how that is reflected in his writings. So, for instance, one of many interesting things I'm discovering about Kafka is he was very interested in sport, including in competitive sports. And we find traces of this even in his literary works. So you can almost directly trace how, for instance, he was following the Olympics. And then this comes into his novels and short stories.
How was Kafka as a reader, and how did his reading influence his writing?
That's a very interesting question again. So first of all, Kafka at some point in his diaries talks about the writers he feels closest to. We might assume these are modern writers, 20th century writers, maybe, expressionist, avant-garde writers, but that's not actually the case. So Kafka's favorite writers are all 19th century writers. So he mentions two German-speaking writers, Kleist and Grillparzer, who's an Austrian writer. And then he mentions Dostoevsky, the Russian writer, and Flaubert. So what's interesting about this list, and he calls them his blood brothers. So he actually feels like almost they are members of the same family. What's very interesting, first of all, it's an international list. It's not just German literature. Secondly, they are all, we would probably say, quite traditional writers. They are all part of the great 19th century tradition of realism. They all write novels, but Grillparzer and Kleist also wrote plays. So I think we need to bear this in mind, that in a sense, when we look at Kafka as a reader, he is more drawn to traditional literature, which describes the world, describes society, describes big themes, rather than, let's say, the more avant-garde experimental writers that were writing at the same time. The second point about Kafka as a reader is that he also really loved popular literature. So he loved adventure novels for children, actually. So even as an adult, he loved to read these adventure stories. And so, he loved reading magazines, newspapers. He had a very, very broad interest. He subscribed to various magazines, including a magazine about the circus. So again, it's this amazing range of interests that Kafka had, but he didn't read very much high-profile, highbrow modernist literature. That's one thing I would stress.
But his writing is completely different, you know. The style is completely different from all this. Whatever his favorite writers are, his writing is totally different.
Yes and no, I would say. So yes, of course, Kafka writes completely differently. Of course, he writes much more kind of, some of his storylines are fantastical, they go well beyond realism. And also he has a very unique way of kind of merging realism and psychology. So very often, of course, we're dealing with these narratives where we can't quite be sure, is this really happening? Is this just in the mind, But yeah, nonetheless, I think to just see Kafka as, let's say, an expressionist writer is sort of to miss the point. I think there is a real tension in his writings about the everyday and the fantastical.
That brings me to the question on your essay on the psychology and psychoanalysis, right, in the same book. You talked about Kafka's interest in psychology, Freud, and Kafka using, this is very interesting, Kafka using experimental psychology for creative inspiration. Could you please elaborate?
Yes. So one of the things no one has really looked at is that Kafka, like everyone going through the Austrian school system in the late 19th century, they all had to study psychology at school in the last 2 years of school. And this was because psychology was seen to be part of a rounded education, really. It was seen actually at the time as a foundation for then going to university and so on. And so Kafka, like everyone else, like people like Freud, for instance, Wittgenstein, this entire generation of Austrian male pupils, they all studied psychology, and they all studied the same textbook by a Prague professor of psychology called Adolf Lindner. And so I just looked at this textbook. I tried to work out what sort of a theory of the mind do they develop. And it's very interesting. It's very much about how when we live in the world, we have a certain interpretation of the world, and everything that happens to us, we have to kind of integrate into this model of the world. So the point of psychology is to, in a sense, create a stable understanding of reality. And then this theory talks about what happens if something really shocking happens, something that is totally different from everything we have experienced before. And so this theory of the mind talks about how really radical experiences can sort of explode our understanding of the world. And so when we look at a novel like The Trial, which Kafka wrote in 1914, you can see that in a sense what happens to Joseph K. in this novel is that he cannot cope with this trial and what it means for his understanding of the world. But there is a very interesting passage Kafka wrote in this novel, which basically describes exactly this theory of the mind, that the point of the mind is to maintain a stable sense of the world. And what this passage says is that when we wake up in the morning, that's the most dangerous moment of the day, because what we have to do the moment we wake up and open our eyes is to stabilize the world around us by being very alert and making sure everything is still the same as it was the night before. When we think about the trial, how does it start? It starts with Joseph K. waking up in the morning. But of course, instead of being able to kind of construct a normal world, what happens is that this guard comes in through his door and arrests him. And after that, nothing is ever the same again. But if we think about this theory of psychology, we could almost say that if Joseph K. had been more alert at that moment, maybe the trial wouldn't have happened. And so I'm not saying that the trial is just an illusion or a dream, but I think it tells us something very important about how Kafka thought about the trial, that it's actually more about what's going on in the mind rather than, let's say, about bureaucracy or institutions and so on.
And the other one you authored, the book that you authored is Kafka and Photography. That's a very interesting concept too. You said that Kafka was ambivalent towards photography as an art form, but his writing reflects his serious interest in the medium.
Yes, that's right. So Kafka was fascinated by photography. He was also fascinated by film. But in a very interesting early diary entry, he compares film and photography, and he says, film is too restless. The eye cannot ever rest. Photography gives our gaze that sort of restfulness which we need. And to this we could add, it's a restfulness we need for writing. And so I think for Kafka, photography rather than film was the major inspiration for his writing. And so there are basically photographs in all three of his novels in one form or another. But where Kafka is really completely obsessed with photography is in his letters, in his correspondence, especially with this woman called Felice Bauer, to whom he got engaged twice. So he lived in Prague, she lived in Berlin. And this meant that this was, of course, a long-distance relationship, and they exchanged hundreds of letters during this relationship. But what they also exchanged was photographs. And so Kafka writes whole letters, whole pages about individual photographs that she sends him. When you look at them, you can see on the one hand, he turns these photos into stories. But he also writes a lot about photography being actually quite unsettling, maybe even quite uncanny. So at some point he describes a photograph of Felice Bauer at a ball. It's a group photograph, and he basically tries to make sense of the photograph, and he can't. So he says, whose hand is that next to you? And where is your arm? And what is it you're wearing? And why is this man standing so close to you? So you can see how Kafka tries to get to the bottom of this photograph. It's almost like a riddle, but he can't. And so there is a sense that Kafka is both very drawn to photographs as a kind of, almost a snippet of life, but also very alienated from them. And I think that sense of incredibly detailed descriptions of the world and of people, which ultimately don't have a clear meaning, that's exactly what we get from Kafka's writings. So we could say that Kafka transforms this uncanny nature of photography and uses it as a kind of technique in his own writings. The other question I tried to think about was, what does Kafka actually think photography is? And I think what he isn't very interested in, or really not interested in at all, is photography as art, which is, of course, something that is very, really important all the way through the history of photography, especially nowadays. So Kafka never writes about art photography. He just writes about photography as part of daily life. He writes about snapshots, about postcards, about, portrait photography, but he somehow does not think of photography as an art. I think he thinks of it as part of everyday life. It's about technology, not about art. I think he thinks that technology and art are somehow two very separate things.
What was the early critical reception of Kafka's work?
So in his lifetime, Kafka was not a famous author, far from it. So it's worth saying Kafka was not completely unknown. Sometimes people say Kafka was this completely forgotten, unrecognized genius. That's not quite true. Kafka published a few books. He published a few collections of short stories, and he was, quite well known in literary circles, to the extent that quite a famous playwright at the time actually dedicated a prize he was awarded to Kafka, because he said Kafka is more worthy of this prize than I am. So in his lifetime, Kafka was probably more of a sort of niche author, but people certainly noticed him. But it was really only after he died, very young, at the age of just 40 in 1924. And so before his death, Kafka asked his friend Max Brod, and he told him to burn all of his unpublished manuscripts, which was about 90% of his works. And Max Brod said to him, I'm not going to do that. If you want someone to burn your stuff, you either have to do it yourself or you have to ask someone else. And so Kafka didn't ask anyone else, but he did leave Brod 2 written letters saying, I want you to do this, but Brod disobeyed Kafka. So, it's interesting. Kafka's work is really a work we were not meant to read at all. But of course, Brod ignored Kafka's wishes. He started editing Kafka's works. And so, Kafka, the world author, is someone who was really only born after Kafka's actual death. And it was really only when Brod started publishing the 3 novels, because the novels were not published in Kafka's lifetime. And so that was really the beginning of Kafka's amazing global fame.
What does writing mean to Kafka?
So I think writing was absolutely the meaning of Kafka's life for him. Kafka was not a full-time professional writer. He worked in an insurance company. So he had a daytime office job. Kafka had studied law. He had got a PhD in law, and then he worked in insurance. And he went to the office every day. Then he came home. He usually took a nap. Then he had dinner, did a bit of exercise, and then he started to write at about 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And he did this every day, and he wrote till about, often 2 o'clock in the morning, and then he went to sleep. And this is really how he wrote all of his work. You can see it's a very demanding schedule. It's a very difficult routine. Kafka often complains about being tired, it was difficult on those days when he wrote a lot. He then couldn't go to sleep because he was too excited. The next day he was then tired, then he couldn't write. But you can see the dedication behind all of this. Kafka never married, he never had any children. He was engaged 3 times, and every time he gets close to getting married, he starts getting very worried about what this would mean to his life. Could he still carry on writing? In one of his letters, Kafka writes, "I consist of literature. There is nothing that I am which is not literature." And he even talks about starving himself of everything else in his life, all the joys of life, friendship, music, literature, and so on, for the sake of writing. So I think writing was, for Kafka, the meaning of his life. And it is quite amazing to read his diaries and letters, to just see that absolute dedication. But at the same time, there were times in Kafka's life, sometimes years, when he couldn't write at all, which must have been very, very painful for him, of course.
Now, this is the final question. See, when you talk about Kafka's literature, on one side, actually what Kafka has produced, right? That is the literature. And the other part of literature is what others have written about Kafka, whether it is biographies or whatever. What are your recommendations? What are your favorites and why?
Good question. So when it comes to Kafka himself, of course, it's very difficult to pick anything. For people who've never read Kafka, I would say probably start with the famous 2, which is The Metamorphosis, the story of a man who wakes up turned into an insect. It's not very long. It's very accessible, even to children. It's almost like a fairy tale, except, of course, it doesn't have a happy ending. And the second famous book is, of course, his novel The Trial, which has been read as a kind of parable about fascism, about totalitarianism. It's an incredibly simple story. You can tell it in basically 2 sentences. I won't give away how it ends, but again, you can see why it's such a famous novel, which has inspired so many writers, filmmakers, artists, and so on. Because one thing I would stress about Kafka is the stories are always very, very simple, and the language is very, very simple, which takes me back to my point about realism. He is a very good observer. You get lots of details about how people look, about clothing, about furniture, about space. But the language itself is simple. It's very plain. It's very descriptive. Kafka is a lawyer by training, and he writes like a lawyer. It's a very clear style. Anyway, so I would say The Metamorphosis and The Trial, but out of the 3 novels, my favorite is probably his first novel, which is called The Man Who Disappeared, or sometimes it's also known as America. I really like this novel because it's about a young person, a 17-year-old. It's quite an exciting, dynamic story. It's set in the United States. It's quite adventurous. Every chapter is set in a new place. So I think for people who think Kafka is very, very sad and depressing, they should definitely have a look at America. And then my own personal favorite is a very short story called Odradek, or Cares of a Householder. And it's a very funny little story. It's only 2 pages long, and it's about basically this little thing, this object, which no one quite knows what its purpose is, but it's basically alive and it moves around the house and it can talk. And it's about this little object from the perspective of a human being who looks at this thing and tries to make sense of it. So those are my suggestions for Kafka's own stories. If you want to read about Kafka, my personal favorite is a German Jewish critic called Walter Benjamin, one of Kafka's first, critics. So Benjamin writes an essay on Kafka in 1934, just 10 years after Kafka's death. It's called Franz Kafka on the 10th anniversary of his death, and I think probably there hasn't been anything written since then which is better, as a kind of just a series of reflections on Kafka. It's again, not very long, probably about 30, 40 pages. But I think not many people have managed to read Kafka so well. So yeah, Walter Benjamin on Kafka would be my top tip. But of course, I'd be very happy if your listeners also checked out my books on Kafka. And there are many, many, many other people who have written very, very interesting stuff on Kafka.
Biography by Rainer Stasch, which was translated by Shelley Fritsch. It was a wonderful book too. Yeah.
They are amazing. It's a 3-part biography. It's quite long. I think it's about 3 times 600 pages. But I think in terms of biography, it's absolutely amazing. They're like literary works in their own right. So I love them. I think they are, very fun to read. So if someone wants to try to understand who Kafka was, definitely read Rainer Stasch.